and it's very much an honor for me to introduce tonight's speaker. So the first time that I met Dr. Sharon Martin, I was impressed / intimidated by her incredible intelligence and charm and credentials, and also because of the fact that she had gotten a very coveted spot in the dream group, which I had not yet been accepted into. And I wanted to be in the group. And so not too long after getting in the group, I got to know Sharon and got to know what an amazing person she is. And one of the great things about her is that despite the fact that she is, such a hero in the community of psychology in Charleston, she is very down to earth and is quite a humble woman about her accomplishments. So I would like to tell you about some of her accomplishments and her background. Sharon is a senior Jungian analyst practicing analysis and psychotherapy in Charleston since 2005. She received her bachelor's and master's degree from Emory University in the psychosocial nurse practitioner program, obtaining advanced certification as a family nurse practitioner and a psychiatric nurse specialist. And this program introduced her to the work of Carl Gustav Jung, and that has become a lifelong passion for her. After Emory, she trained at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, Switzerland, where she received her diploma in analytical psychology. And this degree, by the way, is the only degree that is recognized by the International Association for the Analytical Psychology as granting the title of Jungian Analyst. Since then, in addition to running a busy practice here in Charleston, Sharon has been an executive committee member of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts here in the U.S. for the past 3 years, and she is a faculty member of the Memphis Atlanta Seminar for the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. Additionally, in 2017, Sharon joined the faculty of the C.G. Jung Institute, where she trained in Zurich, and she went there in February of 2017 to teach, and she'll be going back to Zurich once again in June, like next month, to teach another course there. So back to the Jung Society, Sharon also had a very big part in our existence, and she, being humble, she always gives a lot of credit to Mike Etheridge for starting the Charleston Jung Society in 2010. And I do sort of like to think of Mike Etheridge as the father of the organization, but Sharon is definitely the mother. So happy Mother's Day early, Sharon. We're so grateful to have you back and delighted that you came back to present for us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic of the female authority via animus development, Dr. Sharon Martin.
Thanks, Linda. I'd like to thank all the board members tonight. Linda, Betsy, Deanna, Chris, and Larry. Really appreciate the fine work that you're doing here. Excellent job, you guys. Thanks so much for carrying the torch. Really appreciate it. So, I have a lot of material here, as usual, but feel free to interrupt and let's have a discussion. This is a lovely, intimate little group, so I want to make lots of space for you guys to talk or make comments or anything like that. So I'll preface this discussion by saying that learning about Animus development has been and continues to be a very humbling experience. One of my dearest and wisest friends, who is no longer with us, actually laughed out loud when he read my original synopsis. His comment was, "So perhaps the title of your lecture could be The Secrets of the Universe? Or perhaps you will explain to us who is God?" Good luck, he said. And I thought, well, that's a good point. But I've never been one to back down from a challenge, so here we are. So here is how Dr. Jung described animus and anima. Though the contents of anima and animus can be integrated, they themselves cannot, since they are archetypes. As such, they are the foundation stones of the psychic structure, which in its totality exceeds the limits of consciousness, and therefore can never become the object of direct cognition. Though the effects of anima and animus can be made conscious, they themselves are factors transcending consciousness and beyond the reach of perception and volition. Hence, they remain autonomous, despite the integration of their contents. And for this reason, they should be borne constantly in mind, which is a little scary, I think. Ed Whitmont, in his wonderful book, which I always recommend, The Symbolic Quest, says the anima and animus are forever defiant of complete understanding or taming. After we think we have found out everything there is to be found out, they may appear in entirely new and unexpected forms, and there is never an end to this. They connect us with the limitlessness of the psyche itself. This realization is extremely important from a practical viewpoint, for it implies that only constant attention to the unconscious and an inner devoted tribute is sufficient to enlist its cooperation. The unconscious realms cannot be analyzed away, cannot be defeated in battle, but at best by conscious confrontation can be taken into account within the limits of one's individual capacity. So with this in mind, I most humbly and with devoted tribute approach the subject of animus development by first admitting my inadequacy in talking about something ultimately vast and unknowable. And I invite you all to join me today with this attitude, which Dr. Jung, as you know, called a religious attitude, which of course has nothing to do with religion as we generally think about it, or very little to do with it anyway. I chose this subject primarily because I have experienced its crucial importance in my own life and in all my relationships. After many years of my own analysis, it remains profoundly fascinating, very present, and central to my own individuation. I also, in my work, I see how decisive and definitive this is in the lives of the women that I work with and in their relationships. So first of all, we begin with some definitions. What is the animus? Does anybody want to answer this or attempt? It's just really, in some ways, very simple. It's the inner masculine aspect of a woman. That's how Jung defined it. The animus and the anima are two archetypes of very, very special importance. Both are present in every person. You know, we're hermaphrodites, right? This is one of my favorite sculptures, and has been for a very long time before I ever knew what this really had anything to do with. So we're hermaphrodites, all of us. We have both, right? But he designated, Dr. Jung, the anima as a man's inner feminine reality and the animus as the woman's inner masculine principle. He equated masculine consciousness with logos, and feminine consciousness is generally associated with eros. The animus is a woman's, we could call it her recessive maleness, or yang aspect, characterized as energetic, dynamic, and assertive. Its attributes are heat and light, and it's often symbolized by the sun and its rays. Its realms are heaven and the spirit. In its phallic, penetrating aspect, it arouses, it fertilizes and creates, and in its combative form, it combats and destroys. It is essentially outgoing, extroverted, positive and impulsive, but also disciplined, ordering, and ascetic when needed. In other words, it's our urge to get up in the morning and get out into the world every day, making things happen. It is also our capacity for judgment and discernment, for sorting things out and making subtle discriminations. This is why the knight always carries a very fine and very sharp sword in order to cut through and differentiate one thing from another. So we need these swords. When we speak of the Animus Complex, we're referring to one's inner living image of the masculine based on the accumulation of everything masculine that a woman has encountered in her life. Personally, in her own family, and in the culture, in the world, in the media, it's all that we've absorbed. It is therefore a unique and personal image that is imprinted on her psyche, while also is, of course, archetypal. So it's important for us to remember that this is generally an evaluating system that has never been confronted by consciousness, unless we've done some work on it and we've become aware of it. Its consciousness is not the result of repression, but it's pre-existing. It is an autonomous and impersonal entity. One could say it's our legacy. It's a memory or an imprint handed down to us by our parents, our culture, and our ancestors. As such, its judgments and its emotional convictions have not been formed by consciousness. This is really important. But rather, it is the basis upon which consciousness has been founded and from which it has developed. It tends then toward dogmatism, rigidity, and moral generalizations if it remains primitive and undeveloped. So the ego is generally unaware that it has these assumptions, right? These assumptions about what should be and what ought to be. There is an unconscious foundation underlying what the ego imagines itself to know about. You get that? According to Marie-Louise von Franz, it is typical for the animus that, statistically speaking, he is generally right. And that's why we fall for him, right? But he is not right in the actual or individual situation. In other words, the unconscious animus does not allow a woman the freedom to deal effectively and authentically with the actual situation at hand. He just simply assaults her with a whole lot of shoulds and should nots and tells her, and generally anyone else who will hear, what ought to be. So in other words, he destroys her feeling instinct. He robs her of making a choice, a free choice, in the situation at hand. So in Emma Jung's, Carl Jung's wife, in her essay on the animus, she writes, if a woman does not adequately meet the demand for spiritual or intellectual activity, the animus becomes autonomous and negative and works destructively on the individual and in her relations with other people. The fact can be explained as follows. If the possibility of spiritual functioning is not taken up by the conscious mind, the psychic energy intended for it falls then into the unconscious, and there activates the archetype of the animus. Possessed of the energy that has flowed back into the unconscious, the animus figure becomes autonomous and so powerful indeed that it can overwhelm the conscious ego and thus finally dominate the whole personality. So female authority, what is that? It is simply the ability of a woman to claim the validity of her own truth, her own beauty, and her own goodness as originating in her own experience. It means to validate one's own thoughts and actions as good, true, and right. To achieve this experience of being grounded in herself, she must be able to tell the difference between herself and her inner man, or animus. This is animus development. It is not a linear progression. It is a circuitous path of becoming conscious of the other half of the psyche, which is archetypal and, as I've already mentioned, bigger than we are. As such, we must first of all acknowledge and honor this and attempt to get into an appropriate relationship with it. So how do we see the animus first? Anybody want to guess? How do we run into it? Sorry? Daddy. Yeah, it's projected onto dad, first of all, for sure. We meet it in the outer world, generally, like most everything else, right? Because we project whatever is unconscious. This is the experience of falling in love. Also, first with dad, usually, later. So it's the experience both of falling in love and guess what else? Falling out of love and falling into hate, which sometimes looks like this for some of us and sometimes looks like this, depending on your typology, depending on how you, on your wounds, how you manage this. It's overvaluing, undervaluing, intense attraction, and of course, repulsion as well. Whenever you experience intense feelings like this, you can be sure that you're projecting and that you have met some aspect of yourself. So a mate is chosen based on one's inner image of the masculine, which is derived, as I said, from an accumulation of all one's interactions throughout life with masculine figures and energies. We then project this image out into the world onto a suitable recipient, which means really that we find someone who has just the right hook onto which we can hang our projection. This is potentially extremely constructive. For we cannot recognize this inner image unless we find a corresponding image first on the outside. That's how projection works. This is what is so valuable psychologically about projection. When we fall in love or we fall in hate, we are face to face with an unknown dimension of ourselves. And this inner reality is what holds our fascination. The mistake many of us make is in thinking that we can experience reunion with this part of ourselves in a completely external, concrete way, which is partly true, but false in the sense that it must first pass through our inner dimension, which for women is the animus. But we have a chance of recognizing what is internal by encountering it externally first. So there's another way that we encounter the animus, where he shows up, and that is in symptoms, neuroses, problems, usually in marriage or romantic entanglements. We run into these contrasexual aspects in each of us. We also encounter him in addictions, inertia, depression, anxiety, dependency, and in the inability to assert or protect ourselves. These symptoms are generally the result of unresolved grief, dissociated pain, or the dark kinds of feelings that we don't like to really connect with, such as aggression, anger, rage, which belong in the unconscious in a woman to the animus. When we are violated or when we're traumatized, either physically or psychologically, it's normal, very natural to feel angry. But women in particular have a difficult time acknowledging these feelings and making space for them, let alone expressing them, because we've been conditioned to see an angry woman as unattractive, undesirable. So we don't really allow ourselves. We repress it usually without realizing it. Usually not too successfully, right? It breaks out sooner or later. But since no aspect of the psyche can be done away with, the aggression and anger, of course, fall into the unconscious, where they come up autonomously in many ways. and not the least of which are physical symptoms, as well as psychological. But these symptoms are a call from the soul. And if we can hear them, then we're very lucky. To again quote Marie-Louise von Franz, a person with a neurosis has a chance of getting out of the complex. This is being offered. If we miss the chance to get out of it when the time is right, then catastrophe comes, sickness, and so on. So in the transformation of the Animus Complex, in its development, a wonderful writer by the name of Polly Young Eisendroth has outlined 4 stages of animus development. They are animus as alien outsider. That's the first one. Animus as father, god, or king. That's the second. Animus as hero. This is the third. And animus as partner within, which is the restoration of a woman's authority. So we can see more clearly, I think, how this relationship manifests if we turn to an actual case. So that's what we're going to do. I've received permission from my patient to tell this story, although, of course, I've changed many of the details of her analysis and her identity to protect her privacy. So we're going to call our patient Audrey. That's in honor of my mother, since it's Mother's Day. She's no longer with us on this plane, but a lot of this, as you might imagine, is about her and about me. It's all about the mother, right? So we'll call her Audrey, and she came to me. She came into treatment at age 59. Just after her mother's death from osteoporosis that was so advanced that my patient told me that her bones and her spine had just literally crumbled, which is a very interesting metaphor, I think. Audrey herself had suffered from debilitating autoimmune illnesses for many years. When she first came to see me, her blood pressure was elevated, and she was experiencing nausea and also vomiting pretty much daily. She had the early signs of osteoporosis and was taking prophylactic medication. She had a history of chronic fatigue syndrome and had at one time spent several months in bed. When she initiated treatment with me, she was taking both antidepressants and anxiolytics, which is medication for anxiety. She grew up in the Deep South in a prominent family. She married the man her mother wanted her to marry. How many of us have done that? Without realizing it, usually. She described her mother as a miserable, embittered alcoholic, petty, controlling, and demanding. Her father was passive, very passive and unhappy. But he loved his daughter very much. And as you might imagine, her mother was jealous. It's a very typical kind of setup. Growing up in the religious atmosphere of the Deep South, there was one central family value held above all else, and that was the appearance of perfection. Overall, Audrey was confused, depressed, miserable, and physically ill. Although she felt thankful for her financial good fortune, at least she had that. Her husband was very wealthy, and her parents had left her a lot of money. She had a beautiful home, great kids, but something was missing. She felt guilty that she wasn't happy. She felt she should be happy. Her sadness and depression and her anxiety were completely perplexing to her. It became quickly apparent that we would deal with a level of pain that went far beyond her mother's death, which was psychologically and physically crushing her, just as it had crushed her mother. This heavy weight of generational unresolved grief was evident in the woman who sat sobbing before me, ostensibly because she could no longer force herself to perform. This kind of complaint was not new and is still not new to me or my practice. I see many exhausted and anxious women of all ages trying, if they are not performing well, to get back to normal and to force themselves to ignore their feelings and their bodies in order to please God or their husbands or their parents or their children or the church or just everybody out there who expects them to be what they ought to be. They are conditioned to take care of everyone except themselves. And their souls are crying out to live, breathe, and have a voice and a place in the world. The instinctive need for self-care, and this isn't instinctive, the need for self-care and protection could not be expressed in Audrey's family or her culture, and therefore this need led a dissociated life, a separate existence of its own in the unconscious. This is what I saw in the depressed and crippled woman before me. And in her depression and her desperation, I glimpsed a common, pervasive, and deeply embedded pathology. In her dreams, she saw tornadoes. And a recurring theme in her dreams was also not being able to turn on the lights. Because the unconscious had not been able to evoke a reaction from the ego, which would be the beginning of consciousness, or the lights coming on, right? It had dropped into her body, twisting it. She had some arthritis, as well. Her fingers were twisted. Tornadoes are often called twisters, right? And deforming her body and making it very sick. Her body held her unconscious pain and her need. So the following is the first dream she brought into analysis. And in psychoanalysis, we call this the initial dream. And we give it a kind of very special importance because it kind of lays out for both of us what the problem is that will occupy the analysis. So here it is. I'm in the church I grew up in. It is beautiful. It is quiet and very serene. There are doors on either side of the altar. As I enter the door on the right, the scene changes into an attic with lots of rickety steps. I climb them, encountering two unknown men, and then I go up behind the pipe organ. I want to get there, but I never do. It is dark. Variations on this theme had recurred throughout her life. She had dreamt this dream pretty much her whole life. In this particular dream, she is in the psychic state of childhood, which is, if you've read much about trauma theory, you know that childhood is where we initially encounter trauma and where we become dissociated from our feelings. because we're just not ready to handle it yet. So that's where she is. She's in this church that she grew up in as a child. And it's a patriarchal realm where her natural hurt, her anger, her aggression had to be dissociated in the interest of being sweet and quiet and demure. For everybody knows, like I said, I got this message. I'm sure most of you have gotten it too. Although things are changing, the message is still there for women not to be angry. However, it's truly my belief that women are born angry. I mean, we have to be angry, right? Because of 10,000 years of patriarchal oppression. It's in our blood, right? So the upstairs in the dream symbolizes the masculine spiritual aspect, where the music, the pipe organ, this is where the music of her spirit is made. Jung said that men must almost always go downstairs in their dreams, or into the basement to find the anima, into the earth, right? But women must go upstairs. Try as she might, she could not quite find her way to the top. In every dream, she would get lost. The way was precarious. There were these rickety steps. And this dream puts forth the problem, right? She is unable to make contact with the animus. So in this early part of therapy, Audrey was in the first stage of animus development. She had no conscious experience of the masculine aspect of herself, and therefore it was entirely other. It was an alien outsider. At this stage, it often appears in dreams as a primitive man of brute power or force, a murderer, a terrorist, a rapist, or a robber. Or just a force that says, no, no, you can't. I'm not going to let you shine. I'm giving you the thumbs down. And in Audrey's dreams, and this happened many times throughout the time that we were working together, he absolutely forbade her to go upstairs. There were other dreams in which she wanted to go upstairs in a different place, maybe in her house, and her husband would show up and say, no, you can't go. I will not allow it. Or someone else. She just couldn't get up there. These are all figures of the aggressive negative animus. Since her natural aggression had been dissociated, it fell into the unconscious, and there it activated the animus. This is also associated with the negative animus of the mother, which Neumann, in his wonderful book called The Great Mother, called the negative masculine as an attribute of the feminine, which often takes the form of a destructive male companion and is shown in the motif of the vagina dentata. Anybody know what that is? Tina knows. What is, yes? Yeah. Dentata is the teeth. So the vagina with teeth. These come up in the nightmares of men sometimes, right?
Sheila the Gay, too.
Sorry?
Sheila the Gay, a figure
Does it have teeth also, or is it just a cave? Okay, all right. Well, this is, I found this. This is, I think it's somewhere in England, but there it is. All right? Really scary. Dreams of being chased, held at gunpoint, tied up, raped, imprisoned by terrorists, all are experienced as terrifying nightmares which reveal split-off masculine aggression. Nightmares come with an urgent message, attempting to communicate the gravity of the situation. You know, wake up to this. They often wake us up in the middle of the night. The integration and appropriation of this dark energy is a matter of the gravest urgency for this woman and really for all of us as women. So at this stage, a woman is completely identified with or in a symbiotic state with her mother complex. She feels she can only function in the world of the feminine. Here, female power reigns, but it is not validated in the dominant society. She is enclosed and contained within her female gender identity, and if she remains here, she will not achieve power or authority in her culture. If she remains in this primary relationship, she will be childish and immature from the point of view of conscious development. Her power will manifest unconsciously and therefore destructively. So she becomes a bit like this, you know, symbolically speaking. The following dream shows this dilemma. It's a very early dream, and it was repeated 4 times in the same night. I'm in Hawaii, and my mother is with me. Her mother had died, as you recall. I ask her why she came. In each dream, Mother is very angry, and she says, "Audrey, you simply can't keep doing this." We argue about the car we had rented, how much money we're spending, and about why I am even in Hawaii at all. I wake up angry and disturbed. This reveals the inner conflict with the mother as a central problem. It shows the need to move out of dependency on the mother, who wants to control all, who resists the analysis that she's in, like, you know, why are you doing this at all? And all the energy it requires, and also where it will lead to an exotic, beautiful place, quite separate from her mother, though it's not yet free of her mother's influence and her power to torment Audrey. And it's very repetitive, over and over, 4 times in the same night. It's pretty amazing. It's kind of like, you know, the unconscious is saying, you need to get this, right? Going to repeat it over and over. At this stage, split-off aggression, rage, and hatred either go unrecognized or are projected onto males. She experiences these emotions as disruptive to her idea of who she is, so it has to be projected out. At this stage, it is her own excluded masculinity, which remains primitive and disowned. It may also act out in destructive and violent ways, self-torturing by starving or purging, self-mutilation, self-abuse with drugs, alcohol, or other destructive behaviors. Or she may find a man onto whom she projects all of this, split off rage and aggression and allow him to carry this for her. So the way that looks is that he's a very angry, violent man, and she is the helpless victim, and very meek and mild and can't understand why he's doing this to her. Although the aggressiveness is alien to her, that is, to her consciousness, it holds a certain strange and mysterious fascination and may become exotic and tantalizing. This explains the attraction that many women have to violent, abusive, and even criminal men. I was just reading this week about just looking at stuff on the internet about serial killers and that sort of thing as I was preparing this. And there was a man, what was he called? The Night Stalker. Remember that guy in the 80s in California? There was a woman who actually married him after he was sentenced and on death row. She married him. She went and I don't know who married them. I guess the chaplain of the... But anyway, this is not as uncommon as you might think. Women writing letters to criminals, trying to save them, I guess. So she functions primarily in one of two roles, and that would be as mother or as daughter, or an alternating combination of these two. Because she only feels validated or worthy when she is taking care of others, she tends to feel owned by her children, her husband, or other family members that she's taking care of. She tends to carry this caring for them as a burden. She may find it difficult to separate herself even from the most tortuous of relationships because she is dependent on them for feelings of worthiness. She also meets these frightening male figures in her dreams because this is her internal reality. But within this problem lies much untapped energy. Because as she denies her aggression, she destroys her own energy. Because its suppression requires enormous, tremendous energy and effort. Until she makes contact with this internal reality, she will always be blocked, which will bring, of course, depression and exhaustion and even illness. Jung said, those who do not, with reference to anima and animus, those who do not see them are in their hands. Just as a typhus epidemic flourishes best when its source is undiscovered. And Emma Jung, his wife, said, even though she may think otherwise consciously, the idea that what is masculine is in itself more valuable than what is feminine is born in her blood. The feminine principle has been and continues to be profoundly devalued in our culture, in our religions, and in our world. Females naturally feel violated by this system, and anger is the natural response to being violated. Men are also negatively affected by having their inner feminine aspect violated, but that is another lecture. We're not doing that one tonight. However, most of us, if not all, have been conditioned to believe, as I said, that angry women are just unbecoming, to put it mildly. Though we may not believe this intellectually, it still has an enormous impact on us unconsciously. I think I keep pushing forward. Let me back up. Jung says we must be conscious of the spirit of the times, at how deeply affected we are by our history, and about, we live in these modern times, but memory is an imprint. The research shows that, trauma is passed down through the generations, even biologically, somehow. Tim can explain this. He explained it to me once. So, epigenetics, yeah. Very slowly and with great suffering, Audrey acknowledged her imprisoning mother/negative masculine complex. And as it became conscious, she gradually began to experience a little freedom from it. Although her mother had been dead over 2 years, she was only just beginning to be able to have Christmas without the suffocating pressure of her mother's expectation that she'd do it all in a certain way. This woman killed herself over Christmas and decorating the house and cooking the food and buying the presents. I mean, it looked like something out of House Beautiful, but it was utterly exhausting to her. But she began to get a little bit of freedom. She found great joy in these small and simple freedoms. As we worked with her dreams and the complex continued to loosen, the animus showed up in forms not quite so threatening. He evolved into the fatherly patriarchal complex, which is the new stage of development that is ahead. This stage is most acutely associated with what Jung called identity with the Animus Complex. This imprint, or the image that is inherited from family, ancestry, culture, and religion. It is an aspect partly of the collective unconscious, which is the deeper layer, right? The personal unconscious is here, and then the collective unconscious is beneath it. It is as though we have swallowed it in the breast milk or been infused with it in the womb. In this state, a woman cannot distinguish between herself and the animus as something separate from her own thinking and reasoning function. If she is religious, she may hear it as the voice of God speaking to her, actually, or at least God's will. If she's not religious, maybe it's just, she thinks it's herself. She thinks it's her true voice. I remember my own shock when it occurred to me in the midst of a marriage that had been falling apart for maybe about 10 years, and I'd been desperately trying to keep it together, that perhaps it was not God's will that I stay married. I remember, it was truly like the lights came on, because up until then, being a religious person at the time, I just knew that and didn't even question the assumption that God wanted me to stay married. Because staying married is always the will of God, isn't it? Why? Well, because it is. I knew it. Everyone knows, and you have to pay attention to these phrases. Everybody knows. Of course it's true. Everyone knows the children are better off with two parents. God hates divorce. That's in the Bible. and in the vows that most of us have spoken, right? Till death do us part. And they weren't speaking symbolically, all right? These are typical Animus arguments. They are opinions given by an autonomous complex without reflection on the actual present situation. Other animist expressions come out, as I've told you, ought, should, why don't they, why doesn't somebody, don't you think you ought to, you need to. Their pattern reveals a prejudgment, a prejudice. You're working off of assumptions when you hear this. Again, any possibility of choice and relationship depends upon getting out of this state of identity. As long as it persists, we remain estranged from our own identity and power, helpless puppets in the hands of the animus. In this stage, a woman's view of her own femininity is strongly internalized in a very traditional form. She believes, unconsciously, usually, herself to be inferior to men. And when she's a little girl, she believes she's unconscious to boys. And she looks to them for knowledge, guidance, and protection. At this point, the animus takes the form of the patriarch, father, God, or king. This guy with the long beard, right? He is actually what we call the ruling system of consciousness. He's the authority. Now, this is just a symbol, okay, in case you don't happen to buy into this whole Christian thing. This is a symbol of a ruling. Look, he's got the whole world in his hands, right? Here he is on the Sistine Chapel, on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. This is Zeus, the father who gave birth to a daughter without any help, except for the fact that he swallowed his wife. He gave birth to her without, she didn't, he did, right? Athena, she sprang right out of his head, right? Here he is hurling his thunderbolts. And then there is Saturn, who is the god of traditional structures and civilization and death. And this is the guy who actually ate his children to keep them from displacing him. So he doesn't like new things. He likes things to stay the same. Are we putting him in this category?
Yeah, he did not like new things. He resisted change. He was not happy with Jung or Barometer or anybody challenged his ideas.
True. That's absolutely true, which is interesting because he brought some really new and fascinating things. But then he got possessed by, we could say, Saturn, or his patriarchal notion that he wanted to stay in power, and he resisted anything that came after that. And he had a beard. I do have him in here somewhere, I think. This is Saturn. This is Goya. It's pretty terrible. But that is the story, that he ate his children in order to, all of them, until his wife gave him a rock wrapped up in like a baby blanket, I guess, and he swallowed that and thought it was the baby, but she hid the baby, who actually was Zeus. Yeah. So I won't make you keep looking at this. So he's the authority. If he's the authority in her psyche without her realizing it, she is going to mold herself into whatever it is that will gain his approval, right? Her choices here are, generally speaking, to be like a man, to be as good and as smart and as capable and all of that, or to be liked by men, or some combination of these two. Being desired and desirable is of utmost importance. Consequently, beauty and appearance, according to patriarchal standards, are very important. It is one source of power available to her from the male world. At this stage, then, a woman may spend a whole lot of time and a whole bunch of money on her appearance. And she was like this. She always looked really beautiful and perfectly made up and smelled wonderful, and then had plastic surgery. And this isn't necessarily an animus possession, but in her case it definitely was. Now, other types of women may attempt to have their worth validated by way of achievement, but it can still be a facade adapted to the dictates of the patriarchy in order to gain access to power. In this adaptation, she will try to become more like a man in order to gain approval. In either case, she must continually restore her self-esteem through male approval and his reflection of her beauty or her worth and intelligence. Being good, that is, pleasing, is essential here. Not being good triggers judgment, condemnation, and even internal vicious attacks, such as "you're stupid," "you're ugly," "you're bad," even evil. There are many impossible standards at all times to be perfectly beautiful, honorable, truthful, and virtuous. Her pursuit of the masculine other, whom she sees as more interesting, intelligent, and exciting than herself, can take on the quality of an addiction. And Marion Woodman, if any of you have read her, talks a lot about this in her book, Addiction to Perfection. At this stage, the Animus Complex is infused with a sublime and numinous energy, and she may project this out onto her lover, and he may truly feel like a god to her. I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I have. He could do no wrong. He was absolutely perfect. Everything he did was adorable and perfect and brilliant and wise. Time limited, of course. At the same time, the critical and judgmental animus is harshest at this stage. The voice of the complex is a belittling, distant, demanding male voice which judges coldly and demands perfection. She has the experience of something watching her vigilantly for errors, flaws, imperfections, mistakes, and stupidity. She thinks of herself in terms, usually, of what she is not. She thinks of herself in deficit terms. You know, like you get all A's and one B. Do you focus on all the A's, or do you focus on that B? Right? She assesses herself only in terms of what is yet to be done. She may accomplish all kinds of things, but she doesn't focus on that. She focuses on what she hasn't been able to do yet. What she is now and what she has already accomplished have no real value to her at this stage. We find an interesting parallel in a fairy tale entitled Bluebeard. And another name for it is Fitcher's Bird. And it illustrates this dark side. How many of you have heard this tale? In this story, a murderous wizard captures young pretty girls, taking the form of a poor man who goes house to house begging. He carries a basket for collecting food, and when he comes to the house of a man with 3 especially pretty daughters, he had only to touch them, and they jumped right into his basket. After that, he carried them off to his house in a dark forest in order to test them and see if they were worthy to be his wife. He would then leave for a time, designating a room which was off limits, which he provided the key for, but explicitly forbade her to enter. Well, as you know, forbidden rooms must always be entered in fairy tales, right? And there, our heroine enters the room, and to her horror, she finds women murdered and dismembered. This is a long story, but she finally learns how to defeat and destroy Bluebeard by remembering and resurrecting her slain sisters and the previous wives and sending them for help. The help they eventually bring, their brothers and their kinsmen, are the positive masculine aggression in the service of her ego development, which has been missing before this in the story. Only as she finds the courage to look into the forbidden room, that is to look inward and see the horrors of her own dismemberment, the suffering, the shame, and the loss related to living her life in pursuit of masculine approval, can she remember herself and move toward her own authority. According to a commentary by Donald Cowshed on this story, he says, psychologically, this is the inevitable legacy of either outright neglect by her father or his failure to set limits on the daughters, and thereby provide the opportunity for working through aggression within relationship. Both love and aggression must be experienced toward the same father if a woman is to have a whole image of the masculine and be immunized, so to speak, from infection by the negative masculine. This is, I think, perhaps the most tragic aspect of playing out this complex in everyday life for a woman, the terrible vulnerability that comes with having no conscious relationship to the positive masculine. Audrey, our Southern belle, who was taught from birth to repress aggression, sublimate anger, and deny the dark side of her nature, was just such an unfortunate creature. She had to disown her aggression, and the tragedy of that is that this is a quality necessary for psychological development. We must have it. The effect on her relationships with other people is deeply troubling because she demands perfection of herself. Guess what? She's intolerant of other people's mistakes. She does not treat herself with compassion, and therefore she doesn't have compassion, true compassion, for others. At this point, she often compensates for her self-doubt by becoming very forceful with her opinions, which are generally dogmatic, rigid, undifferentiated, and cold. She may also become manipulative and passive-aggressive. However, the strengths of this type of woman are many. Employers love her, usually because she is diligent and tireless in her pursuit of perfection. She's hardworking, and she usually sticks to the established rules and of task and organization. And she is able to rally herself to accomplish heroic tasks. Now, the dark side of this is what I call a broken barometer for stress. She doesn't know her limits. She may unconsciously feel that she doesn't, or at least shouldn't have any. In this way, the demanding Father God Animus may literally drive her into the ground, consuming her energy to the point of fatigue and even exhaustion. In my work, I encountered this level of severe collapse in previously very highly functional women far more often than you might imagine, because we really believe that we can do it all. We really think that's true, but that's not the true voice. That's the voice of the Animus at this stage. As she continued to step back from the complex and reflect on it by way of her symptoms and her dreams, she began to see that this was not her value system at all, but one that she had inherited. She began to realize that she had given away her power and authority and come under the power of the unconscious. As this discovery began to dawn on her, she experienced grief, fear, and emptiness. As the complex loosened, her fear became palpable, as though the only structure she had ever relied on was falling away and being taken away from her. Inwardly, and sometimes outwardly, truly, she trembled because she felt that she was losing God and everything she had counted on to keep her safe. So there was a lot of fear. We worked with this complex by first identifying it as not me, not her, and by personifying it and giving it a name. She imagined and she painted a figure wearing long black robes as someone who incessantly criticized, judged, and condemned her. She called him the judge. This gave her some distance from him and also made it possible for her to begin to dialogue with him. For example, in response to hearing, "Oh my God, you are so stupid, you never do anything right," she began to talk back to him with, "Actually, I'm not stupid. I am intelligent and I have accomplished much, and I do many things right." Differentiating the voice of the Animus from her true voice is the key that unlocks hope, that the complex can be transformed and actually eventually become a helpful psychological factor. And with this differentiation, she began to move into the next stage of development. So I think we're going to take a break here.